thrilled to invite this panel to continue the conversation that we've already begun this morning. And as with the other panels that we have been blessed with throughout this conference, we also have an esteemed group of people who will be sharing out of their experiences and out of their scholarship. And so without further ado, I'd like to introduce our panel. We have a fairly large panel, and they will each share briefly. And then, as we've done over the course of the past day and a half, we will open the floor and invite you to engage us in conversation. Our first panelist is Vilson Caetano de Souza, Júnior. And he is the director of the Center for the Studies of Indigenous and African Peoples at the Universidade do Estado da Bahia. His teaching interests include anthropology and Afro-Brazilian populations, religious syncretism, and his most recent publication is Nago, the Nation of Itinerant Ancestors. Our second panelist is Peter Nash, and he is the Franklin I. and Irene Saman Professor of World Communities, and he is the Professor of Religion and Liberal Studies at Wartburg College. Professor Nash, his research interests include intercultural readings of the Bible, global communities, African and the ancient Near East, Norwest Semitic philology. And his most recent publication is Reading Race, Reading the Bible, and it's been published in English, Portuguese, and German. Our third panelist is Anthony Reddie. And Anthony Reddie is a research fellow at the Queen's Foundation of the Ecumenical Theological Education in Birmingham, and he is a consultant in Black Theological Studies for the British Methodist Church. He is the editor of the Black Theology Journal, which is an international journal. His most recent publication includes Working Against the Grain, Black Theology in the 21st Century. Our next panelist is Robert Burns Steptoe, who is the chair of the African American Studies Department and professor of English, African American Studies, and American Studies at Yale University. Professor Steptoe teaches courses in the area of American autobiography, African American poetry, fiction, and drama. And his most recent publication is Blue as the Lake. Our next panelist is Diane Stewart. She is the Associate Professor of Religion and African American Studies at Emory University. Her teaching interests include theologies and religious practices of the African diaspora, with special emphasis on Black and womanist theologies. She is also interested in African-derived religions. Her most recent publication includes Three Eyes for the Journey, African Dimensions of the Jamaican Religious Experience. And then Cornel West, who is the class of 1943 University Professor of Religion in the Center for African American Studies at Princeton University. His teaching interests include philosophy of religion and cultural criticism, and he has many publications, which also include Race Matters and Democracy Matters. And as Professor Towns already mentioned, our translator is Luis Nascimento. Thank you for being here. Our panel will speak in the order that they are listed in the program, even though they're not sitting in that order. But to review the question again, our question is, how does history and memory shape us as diasporic people? Como a historia e a memoria nos forman como a pessoas de diaspora? I invite our panel to begin, and we will begin with Professor Vilson.
Quero saudar todos e a todas.
I want to greet everyone
e falar da minha alegria em estar aqui com vocês e já aproveitar para estar agradecendo o convite que a mim foi feito pela Emily e que foi ajudado pelo Peter Nash.
I want to thank you for the opportunity to be here and especially I would like to thank Dr. Emily Towns for inviting me, and also Dr. Peter Nash, who has been helping me in this process.
E dizer que eu me sinto muito à vontade em ser um não cristão entre cristãos.
And I want to express that I feel very comfortable to be a non-Christian among Christians.
Então, na verdade, a minha fala vai ser uma fala a partir das religiões de matrizes africanas que foram reorganizadas no Brasil.
And I'll be speaking from the perspective of African religions that have been brought to Brazil.
Como me pedido uma conversa, eu então vou iniciar essa conversa contando uma história.
I will begin the conversation by telling a story.
E a história é a história de uma mulher que, após muitas horas de trabalho, ela se perdeu no local onde ela estava.
And this is the story of a woman that, after long hours of work, she was lost in a forest.
E como estava muito escuro, ela não conseguia ver mais a saída onde ela estava.
As it had got very dark, she could no longer see the way out of the place where she was.
Essa mulher então começou a passar as mãos na barriga.
So the woman started to pat her stomach.
E ela foi percebendo que cada vez que ela passava as mãos na barriga, a sua barriga ia se transformando em águas.
And every time she did that, she touched her stomach would turn into water.
Até o momento que as águas conseguiam levar esta mulher de volta à sua casa.
And the water that came out of her stomach led her back to her home village.
Me parece que essa é uma imagem bastante positiva para nós estarmos pensando a diáspora africana nas Américas.
And I think this is a very positive image for us to think of the diaspora.
Nós estamos aqui, nós só somos possíveis, nós só chegamos aqui graças a cada uma dessa mulher trazida pelos nossos antepassados.
And we are here because of all those women who brought us and who were representing our ancestors.
Então, na verdade, nós não podemos pensar nessa diáspora africana nas Américas sem levarmos em conta a grande necessidade que esses diferentes grupos africanos tiveram de reorganizar o seu mundo.
We cannot think of the African diaspora in the Americas without thinking and taking into consideration the process of reorganization of African belief that the Africans who came to the Americas had to do.
É um pouco desses elementos que fundamentam as chamadas religiões afro-brasileiras.
And this is what fundaments the African Brazilian religions.
Como, por exemplo,
As for example,
a noção de família,
the notion of family,
a noção de comunidade,
the concept of community,
a importância da mulher,
and the importance of women,
a importância dos velhos,
the importance of the elderly,
a importância das crianças,
and the children,
a importância do corpo,
and the importance of the body,
a importância da natureza e, de forma especial, da água e da terra.
the importance of nature, and in special, the importance of water,
Mas a importância, sobretudo, dos antepassados.
and most of all, the importance of our ancestors.
A retomada desses elementos, eles estão nos proporcionando vários tipos de leituras.
And as we begin to rethink and reconsider all of these elements, this can help us in our rereading of this tradition.
Uma das mais importantes é a ideia do continente africano como o berço da humanidade.
And one of the most important ideas is the idea of the African continent as the birthplace of humanity.
Isso tem motivado uma série de revisões.
This has led to a lot of, rethinking.
Revisões da própria teologia,
Rethinking of theology,
revisão das várias liturgias
rethinking of liturgy,
e um grande desafio que seria o diálogo com as chamadas religiões de matrizes africanas.
and the challenge of engaging in dialogue with the religions of African origin,
Que vai muito mais do que o respeito e muito mais do que a escuta.
that has to go way beyond only respecting and listening,
Mas vai da afirmação ou da aceitação dessas religiões como também lugar de uma revelação do sagrado.
and this conversation requires that we acknowledge the nature of those African religions as the place of sacred revelation.
E isso talvez coloque para os cristãos o grande desafio de perceber em outras religiões diferentes expressões desse Deus.
And this is a challenge for Christians to try to see in those religions an expression of God, a manifestation of God.
Talvez uma das resistências que tenhamos que superar seja a nossa visão de sincretismo.
And maybe one of the most important things we have to overcome is our conception of syncretism.
Sempre se pensa o sincretismo a partir de uma relação somente de força, onde os descendentes de africanos eles foram obrigados a ceder ao cristianismo e em algumas regiões especificamente ao catolicismo.
We usually think of syncretism in terms of a power relation leading Africans to be overcome and to be subjected and also to become Christians.
Na verdade, nos meus últimos trabalhos, eu venho demonstrando de que existe uma possibilidade de fazermos uma nova leitura disso que se chama sincretismo.
In my recent works, I have been trying to work the idea that we can rethink this notion of syncretism.
Uma leitura positiva, pensando nos diferentes diálogos que as comunidades negras, todas elas, tiveram a possibilidade de fazer com esse diferente.
We need to think of all those different expressions as opportunities for us to engage in this with those communities that had to do this, rethink of those traditions and to. Você pode repetir o que você falou na última vez? Só repita o que você falou o último. I'm sorry. Assim, sobre a questão da comunidade.
Sincretismo como a releitura que a comunidade negra fez.
Yes, so we have to, rethink and engage in dialogue, recognizing the syncretism of that those communities, the black communities, had to do.
Outro grande desafio que nós encontramos são os desafios representados pelos saberes tradicionais.
And another challenge is to recognize the traditional wisdom.
Entendidos como um conjunto de conhecimento que está baseado numa experiência de muitos anos, que faz parte da vida de nossas comunidades.
recognizing them as a collection of knowledge that has been gathered along the history of the black people.
Me parece que isso nos permite pensarmos, de fato, a importância da memória e da história para a continuidade como homens e mulheres no mundo.
And this permits us to think of memory in terms of something that helps us to continue existing in the world as humans, as men and women.
E, de uma certa forma, isso vai nos ajudar cada vez mais a trabalharmos a questão da nossa autoestima.
And this will help us work out the self-esteem that we need.
Ainda no Brasil, se insiste muito na necessidade de estarmos reforçando a beleza do negro, a beleza da negra.
Presently in Brazil, we have been trying to reinforce the idea of the beauty of black men and women.
E essa necessidade nós percebemos que ela deve acontecer desde o primeiro momento que a criança vai para a escola.
And this is something that we have to do from the very first moment the child is born.
Então, na verdade, temos que começar a contar a nossa história a partir de outros referenciais.
We have to start retelling our story from other perspectives.
Por isso que nós temos insistido que há duas maneiras de contar essa história.
And this is why we maintain that there are two different ways to tell this story.
Uma história a partir da escravidão.
A story from the point of view of the history of slavery.
Uma história a partir de homens e mulheres, reis, rainhas, príncipes e princesas que foram escravizados.
Or the story of kings, queens, and princes that were enslaved.
Mas, sobretudo, o nosso grande desafio é proporcionarmos momentos como estes que nos dão a possibilidade de estarmos falando de nós mesmos.
And another challenge is the one, having other opportunities and like this, gatherings, that permit us to engage in dialogue and to be listening and talking about ourselves.
Thank you.
Obrigado. Thank you.
I came up here today just hoping to make sure I got to speak before Cornel did. I see I wasn't careful enough. I add my thanks to Dr. Emily Towns, who has invited me to two really great parties in the last few years, this being one of them. The last time I was formally connected in any way, and it's very tenuous, I understand, with Yale Divinity School was in 1976 at the Interseminary Women's Conference. Do they still have that? They still do that? The topic, as I remember it, vaguely as a second-year seminary student, was something to do with feminist theology. And Cubana, perhaps a mujerista, but I don't think that was alive and running just yet, stood up and said, your feminism is killing women in my country. And as an African-American male, oh, sorry, I wasn't African-American yet, that was 1976. As a black male, I got some of it. I understood a little bit of how the enrichment of some in the systems that we tend to work in impoverishes others. As a Lutheran theological wannabe, I didn't get some of it, obviously, and I'm still learning that. And I'm going to tell you some stories about some of what I've learned along the way, about how what we do here in venues like this enrich some and impoverish others. And some of where I think the conversation needs to go in order for it to be a real conversation in the diaspora. Touching on my theological heritage, let me just say I'm a Northwest Semitic philologist by education. And when I start to talk Northwest Semitic philology, most eyes roll back, or people just go, whatever. And I have a smattering of theological education, and when you all start talking theology and ethics, my eyes roll back. So that's already one of the bridges that we need to build between people in biblical studies and the ancillary fields. Of course, I'm in an ancillary field of biblical studies. We couldn't be a field of our own. I did understand as a Lutheran the idea of simul justus et peccator, that we are simultaneously justified even as we continue in our sinful state. And some of us didn't like the idea that it's human nature. Some of us said yes, would we need have said that earlier today? That is our nature, and we are constantly struggling against it. But for about 25, 30 years now, I've been telling black Lutherans every opportunity that I get that we are the best interpreters of Luther's simul justus et peccator, because we are stuck in the middle. We're at the bottom of the pile in so many ways, not all of us, and certainly not the people in this room, in the U.S. and in the structures. And yet when you look in Brazil, where I had the privilege to live for 8 years, if you look in Southern Africa, where I've been on a number of occasions, if you look in the Caribbean, where I've been a few times, boy, do we have it good. Boy, do we have it good. We don't have as much sunshine in Iowa as they might, but most of us have enough to eat. Most of us have access to good medical care. The first thing that I remember publishing was a long book review, what do they call that, a review article in Christian Century about Shelby Still's content of our character. And the title was something like Exodus Out of Memory, so it kind of fit this conference. There be giants in the land. And if you remember Still's argument back then, it was that we are our worst own enemies, which I didn't agree with then, and I don't agree with now. But I do think that a big problem for African-American community in the United States, or Afro-diasporan community in the United States, is we have bought a lot of the propaganda. Some of what Vilson just talked about. We have bought a lot of propaganda from the oppressors. And we continue to perpetuate it in some of the ways we present ourselves. Not by any means all of them. But that's a real struggling point for me, is when is it important to be bad? And how many different ways we have captured that word, recaptured it, much like the gay community has recaptured gay and re-signified it. What is good about being bad in African America? As I first thought about this conference, after we got the question, I thought about the Tower of Babel and the diaspora. These aren't notes, Emily. Stay where you are. I thought about the Tower of Babel, and I thought about the Exodus story, going back to the review article, and how often we have bought the propaganda and allowed the oppressor to tell us that they are God. That if they're not God, they get to choose who they get to be and tell us who we have to be. So in the Tower of Babel, the scattering of peoples and the separation by language, a story in Brazil, a story in all the Caribbean, a story in the United States, of dividing people so they couldn't be with folks in their language groups, in their cultural groups, and force them to learn the oppressor's language. Interesting story about their home state. The Brazilian captors made the mistake of putting Muslims together. And finally in 1835, 1838, they forbade the importation of Muslim Africans because they all spoke some Arabic. And Brazil had more slave revolts than all of the rest of the Americas put together. And then I started thinking about questions of the interpretation of the curse of Canaan, or the curse of Ham, as it's often mistakenly called, and the way in which European Americans and Europeans took on the role of the new Jews, the new Israel, a role which we have seen they pretty much despise, except for when it's to their advantage, and imposed upon us the role of Ham's descendants, or Canaanites, a really bad piece of eisegesis that unfortunately many of us have bought into. And again, not so many people in this room, of course, but I've heard from top to bottom, from Nova Scotia to Tierra del Fuego, although I haven't quite made it there yet, in the Americas, that somebody in the black community is still talking the trash of we are the cursed people. And this is the way to get us out of slavery to whatever animism, whatever Islamic tradition, whatever tradition that is not Christian, and get us into that tradition. I am very happy myself to be a Christian, but I don't think I should impose it on anyone else. So just one more story, one more thing before this last story. And that is when we talk about white people, I'm really not doing this to pander favor, but when we talk about white people, in the same way that we insist that we distinguish between black folk or among black folk, that we allow that same privilege for white folk to identify themselves, not so they can exculpate themselves from their participation in a racist system, but there are just a lot of them that weren't even white until World War II. When the government needed them, they became bit by bit white. And the Jews are very confused about this still today, where they fit in that piece. My wife is a Dane who's lived in the States for 5 years now. And she is writing a piece called Forced to be White. Because all of the things that come with whiteness in the United States, she, for the most part, doesn't know. That's not what they teach in Danish schools. It's not the same thing. But let me end with this story real quickly. In 1995, two brown men, officials of the Lutheran Church, Puerto Rican and African American, conspired to send another brown man to Brazil, to the whitest church in America, to fix something. So I was part of the last colonial experiment in mission in the ELCA, I hope. Anybody who saw me that August in 1995 getting on the plane saw, by now, an African American. We were African Americans by then, called ourselves African Americans. When I arrived in Brazil, in Sao Paulo, I was immediately told, well, you're not black. You're brasileiro, you're mineiro, you're baiano. The skin color, there are 187 different distinctions for racial categories in Brazil, unlike the 3 or 4 or 5 that we have here. And the funniest one was you're negro paraguayo, a Paraguayan black, because everything from Paraguay is counterfeit. And they were about 20 years into the Black is Beautiful movement that you heard Vilson talk about. And I'll just, as I've tried to indicate, black means something very different in Brazil from what it means in the United States, and that's a conversation that we need to listen to. We need to be hard listeners when we start to talk with Brazilians in large numbers. Came back on Christmases, and I was black again, or African American again. I went to a conference in South Africa, or a conference in Zimbabwe going through South Africa, where I was temporarily black in the almost new South Africa. And then I got to Zimbabwe. I sat down at a table with a woman who could have been my cousin. And she told me, I continued to say sir to the waiter who was a black Zimbabwean. Now, this is 6, 7 years after independence in Zimbabwe. And she said, why do you call everyone sir and ma'am? I said, it's just the way I was raised. But he's black. And I was just stunned. I said, but I'm black. And she said, no, you're foreign colored. I went back to Brazil, the south of Brazil, where I would it's like the United States, about 13% Afro-descendant, where I very, very definitely am black in that part of Brazil. Sort of like moving around in the United States, but still very different. And then I came back to the States for Christmas, and I was African-American again. So in a matter of about 40 days, I was African-American, I was foreign colored, I was black, I was negro, I was baiano, I was brasileiro, I was mineiro. In 1999, I taught for 3 months in Mozambique. At the end of my time in Mozambique, I went to buy presents, as we all do. And I went to the market, and I was disturbed to be charged the foreigner tax. And it was because of my Brazilian accent. There are 3 people in the room who understand how funny that is when I say I have a Brazilian accent. And I complained to one of my students, and she said, but of course, professor, look at your white skin. Next time, take a black person with you. So I've told Emily this story, and I've threatened to publish it, and published a part of it in a book. But I want to do an article about all of this, about becoming a white man in the third world, and how much power I carried with me simply by carrying a blue passport into many different countries and situations. And what I represented to one very German Lutheran church from another very Scandinavian Lutheran church, and how they saw me as the harbinger of money and opportunity, and how much I need to own that when I sit down and have a conversation, so that I don't just say, I got the money, we're going to do what my church says we're going to do. And on a slightly lighter, or maybe not so light, maybe slightly heavier, but I'm still joking, kind of, sort of. So in Mozambique, I finally became a white man in the third world. And today I sit at Yale University, an official invited guest of the university, with what I learned in San Diego last year, the smartest man in the world. Eddie Glaude told us that twice or 3 times about Cornel at AAR. And so I wonder if, to those people with whom we want to talk right now, if this isn't as white as it gets. Thank you.
Well, folks, I bring greetings from England. My name's Anthony Reddie. When I was invited by Professor Emily Towns, and I'm extremely grateful for the invitation, as the information came through as the months got closer, I looked at a piece of paper and saw that I was sharing a panel with Cornel West. So I told my family about this, and it tells you something of the difference in perspectives when for myself, I'm itching to ask him about race matters or democracy matters. When I told my brother, he said, ask him about the Matrix. Ask him about the Matrix. The hell with the books, ask him about the Matrix. I live in very different worlds to most of my family. I'm part of the African diaspora, but I belong to a particular subsection of it, which is a Caribbean diaspora. That my ancestors came from West Africa to the Caribbean. And then Carol Phillips, who's a well-known Caribbean writer, wrote a famous novel called The Final Passage. And my parents, along with approximately 500,000 people from the Caribbean, travelled from the islands of the Caribbean back to the so-called mother country. So my parents arrived in Britain on the 22nd of January, 1957. I spent 34 years there and now currently reside back in Jamaica in happy retirement. So I grew up as a first-generation Caribbean migrant in a country that was a mother country that had specifically asked for people from the Caribbean to come to rebuild the country after the Second World War, and largely to do the jobs that white folk didn't want to do. So my father worked in a factory where the only other white people were either Irish or Poles. And he worked in a factory with non-trade union labour. And these were the days before the minimum wage in Britain, which hell knows the minimum wage ain't much, but at least there was a minimum wage now. But it didn't exist in the 1950s. And in the family I grew up in, it was, in many respects, a classic diasporan family in that my parents sought to recreate Jamaica within their own home. So long before I went back to Jamaica for the first time, age 16, I felt I knew the place. And I want to share three very quick stories. I'm very much a narrative theologian, so I kind of work through story. And I want to share. I'll take up my watch here, because unless it turned into a sermon. The first story really actually is for my mother, who remains my greatest inspiration. And in the corner of her bedroom, her and my father's bedroom, there was a blue trunk. And this blue trunk was what my mum called her life spare trunk. And life spare simply meant that if her life was spared, these were the things of the provisions she would bring back to Jamaica for poor relatives. And periodically, particularly at moments I think where she felt extremely sad. If you've ever been to Bradford, don't. It's the land that time forgot. I'm not quite sure why you would travel several thousand miles and end up in a place as bleak as Bradford. It's a bit like Pittsburgh, but worse. No disrespect to anyone who comes from Pittsburgh. It's not a pretty place. It's a hard industrial place where most people who live there, it's because they can't afford to live anywhere else. So our parents went there because they needed cheap labour. And so at times when my mum felt quite sad and depressed, she would go and open this blue trunk and just inspect it and look at it. And she would sing hymns and psalms as she was. I would watch her. And the interesting thing which I've now come to theorise around, and that's the good thing about being a scholar, like you can theorise around stuff that you used to take for granted and make it sound all intelligent and clever. I would watch my mum open her trunk, and it was interesting how time and space was collapsed. Because at one point she would talking to her grandmother, talking about her great-grandmother. So you were, in the space of one conversation, you were actually talking about people who lived over 100-odd years ago, and certainly my great-great-great-grandmother lived through the Morant Bay Rebellion in Jamaica and knew Paul Bogle. And she would talk about that, and then within a second she'd be talking about something that happened last week. And then the next second she'd be talking about something that happened when she was a girl growing up in East Portland in Jamaica in the 1940s. And she kind of flicked through from back, forwards, back, without hesitation or deviation. And after a while, I learned that there was something special, something very sacramental about this trunk, in the sense in which it pointed beyond itself. It wasn't just an object. There was something deeply significant about the way in which her engagement with this trunk both connected her to a past through stories and through experiences about our enslaved forebears in Jamaica, and then also pointed to a fairly mythologized future of what her return to Jamaica would be like, and the expectations that England was never going to be home for her, that she was just here to make a life for her children, and as I say in Jamaican, as soon as the picnic come of age, then like she was going to pick up her fuck and go home, and she did in 1991. And so for me, I guess I learnt a lot about myself and my own identity by observing my mother and her trunk. That I learnt that although I speak with a Yorkshire accent, much modified, I mean, in my family, they're convinced that I've gone all bourgeois and posh now. This is a posh Yorkshire accent. But when I was growing up, it was very clear that I wasn't like all the other white kids in our housing estate, that I belonged somewhere else. And there were a set of stories and narratives that my parents shared, especially my mother, and particularly when she was expecting her trunk. And the second thing that really orientated me, and certainly in terms of talking about memory and history, were a series of wise sayings that all the older mothers and community mothers would share. I think a specific type of what one might call sort of proverbial wisdom about how you engage with the world. That I think all mothers of the African diaspora, I think one of their central tasks has been to help their children to learn that the world out there is not a safe one. And you have to know how to handle yourself. You have to know when to speak and when not to speak. When to speak the truth and when to speak a modified version of the truth, and when just to signify and throw people off by indirection. I collected a number of these a number of years ago when I was doing my doctorate. And I just want to share a couple. I'm not going to interpret them. You can do that for yourself, or you can ask me afterwards. I'll try to do it in my best modified English, because if I do it in Jamaican patois, most of you probably won't follow me. First one. If wishes were horses, then beggars would ride. What sweet a goat's mouth to burn his tail? You must take sleep, mark death. The higher the monkey climbs, the more him get exposed. If you want good, then your nose must run. You must learn to dance at home before you dance abroad. This is my personal favourite. This is the one my mother used to say interminably when I was growing up in Bradford. You can't sit on a cow's back and cut the cow's skin. Just a couple more. You should never be too licky and too nyammy. And finally, wanty no getty, and getty no wanty. What I observed from the occasions when these sayings were often said, usually when you'd done something wrong. Of course, as a model child, I never did that, so I didn't hear these very often. Was that they were never explained. That part of the skill for you was to connect the context to the saying. And there's a sense in which I think for a whole generation of us, certainly as first-generation migrants living in a overwhelmingly white country, and I have to stress that black people make up 1%, people of African descent make up 1% of the population. If you count all non-white people together, we make up 7% of the population. Britain is an overwhelmingly white country, despite what the far right always want to say about repatriation and too many coloured people in the country. It's a nonsense. It's an overwhelmingly white country. And in that context of being an extreme minority, it was about learning how to navigate your place in the world. And part of my concern, on a very personal note, is that I think maybe even the space of only 50 years of a mass community in Britain, that we have begun to lose some of our wisdom. That, like to quote my grandmother, you can be an educated fool. You can have all the knowledge in the world but no wisdom. And I suspect that a successive generation have gone through schooling with high qualification but ain't as wise as their ancestors who were supposedly stupid. And finally, final story comes from when I was a youth worker, a youth pastor, before I entered the academy. And I worked for 2 black majority Methodist churches, 2 churches that were mainly made up of these Caribbean migrants. And as about a year into the job, when we got a new pastor, he was a young white guy fresh from seminary, fresh from Theological Education, who'd been sent to the church because we couldn't get another person, so he came cheap. So this white guy came with lots of good ideas. And I have to confess, if there's one thing that convinced me I should become a scholar, it was meeting a white guy who convinced that he knew more about black people than I did. I'd grown up in a Jamaican family, and I figured at that point the only thing he would take seriously is if I had letters in front of my name telling him that I knew what I was talking about. Because see, he came with this clear idea that it's a poor black community, and therefore what they needed was white paternalism and white generosity. So he connected our church with one of the churches he'd grown up in as a child, which is a very prosperous white middle-class church. And this white middle-class church, in their generosity, they ran a second-hand shop, and they give away or sell very, very cheap but very decent second-hand clothes. And so he decided that he would get a job lot of these clothes and bring them to this church, and these poor black people would go and buy the clothes. Well, two things you know. Firstly, that black people are proud people. So, like, we ain't going to wear, like, no handoff, like, from rich white folk. It ain't going to happen. But secondly, and I remember pleading with him, say, you know something, the people will not buy the clothes. He said, oh, yes, they will. I've spoken to them, and they've said yes. And I'm saying yes, but, like, they're humouring you. When you say, you know something, I've got this good idea, and they say, oh, yes, Pastor. Trust me, they're humouring you. You're the pastor, and they don't want to insult you or hurt your feelings, but they're not going to buy second-hand clothes. So he ignored me. We brought in this whole huge amount of clothes, filled up the whole church hall. They opened at 8 o'clock. From 8 o'clock till 8 o'clock at night, we did not sell a thing. All the black folk turned up in the church. They looked at it. They felt the stuff up. Looked really nice, and put it down and walked on. See, the thing you didn't understand is, and again, it's something I grew up with, that you do not wear clothes from people you don't know. You don't know where the clothes have been, and you don't know what spirit has inhabited the clothes. This guy simply did not get it. I guess an interesting, as we talk about African retention, I guess the final thing I would say, it's only recently now, since I've done a lot of traveling in my work, that I forced myself, I guess out of necessity, to learn to eat from strangers. Because when I was growing up, you didn't eat from people you didn't know. I still remember going with my mom to a friend, and this was a friend, this is another black person now, it's not a white friend. A black person, I sat there and we'd left, and I was really hungry. And the woman said, oh, I'm cooking, do you want something to eat? And I said, yes, and my mum just stamped on my toe. And I'm sitting there, and my stomach is rumbling big time. But she said, oh, you're not hungry? I'm sure Anthony's hungry. I want to say yes, but my mum's giving me that look. No, I'm not hungry, I said. And afterwards, on the way home, when I said to my mum, I was quite young, I said, but Mum, I was really hungry. And my mum said, don't worry, we'll get food from people we know. She's not good people. You don't eat from people you don't know because you don't know what they're going to do. I think the final thing I would say that interesting, I guess part of the challenge is to get maybe many of our communities to own this knowledge. Because even now, and my mum's 80 and back in Jamaica, you can't get her to explicitly own this stuff. So why don't you eat from strangers? You know, when you say euphemistically, they might do something to you, what is it they might do? When you leave your Bible open on your bed as you leave the room, and conscious of many of the elders, you do that to keep the spirits away. What spirits are you talking about?
You know, like a couple other people on this panel, I was worried about following Cornel West. And now I have to follow Mr. Reddie here. When he was reading those sayings, he offered one. What was your phrase about the...
How the monkey climbs.
Yeah. He read this one: the higher the monkey climb, the more it get exposed. Well, when I was growing up in Chicago, it went this way. The higher the monkey climbs the tree, the more he shows his ass. So what we're up to here is a diasporic moment. Well, thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here. This is an extraordinary event, extraordinary bringing together of all of us, and I want to thank Emily Towns and everyone at the Divinity School and everyone involved for having this happen. This is something of a homecoming and something of a family reunion, too, and I think we all feel that. I would like to approach the question of how history and memory shape us as a diasporic people by rephrasing the question and asking, how do we inevitably entwine the historical and the imagined in remembering Middle Passage in particular? In pursuit of this question, I wish to focus today on the names we recall of the slave ships that facilitated the slave trade, and on the names we've chosen to imagine for those ships. This fascinates me because part of the work of African American literature has been to keep the names of the slave ships before us, partly so that we can be perennially attentive to the ironies and contradictions in American history that have prompted African American cultural forms. Ralph Ellison once famously wrote that in the United States, in the beginning was the Word, and the contradiction of the Word. And if it is indeed true that in the beginning, the first slave ship to arrive to America was the good ship Jesus, then we have a whole lot to sort out and to understand and to come to terms with. Lucille Clifton, in her poem Slave Ship, goes right at us about this historical matter when she begins her poem with these lines: loaded like spoons into the belly of Jesus. We read those lines and suddenly become uncomfortable. We find ourselves hoping that Clifton is only talking about the belly of a boat, right? Robert Hayden lists the names of 10 slave ships in his epic poem, Middle Passage. And the first name is Jesus. In this poem, the accent and context situate Jesus as Jesus and as Spanish, an obvious reference to the Spanish slave trade that befits a poem that concludes with testimony from the Amistad case. And of course, Amistad is another one of those names. Friendship, that's another contradiction. But Hayden, like Clifton following him, includes a mix of English and Spanish bright, ironical slave ship names, his list including, in addition to Jesus, Estrella, star, Esperanza, hope, mercy, desire, adventure, Tartar, Anne, and Bella J, as well as Amistad. Since Emily Towns asked me to make a comment and not offer a paper, let me just go to a list of slave ship names. I want to read about 20, maybe even 25 such names. The names of slave ships that I found on the internet, a place at a location called the Ship Name Index. All of the names that I'm about to read are English names, but they are enough to make the point that we remember and imagine Middle Passage by handling, if you will, the names of the boats. Here's the list I want to share with you. Just take each one of these in, please. Actress. Agent. Budget. Whose budget? Calypso. Here's one for all of us as we think of history. Clio. C-L-I-O. How about a slave ship named Columbus? How about Commerce? Delight. Eagle. Here's a good one. Immigrant. Slave ship named Immigrant. Forgive me for listing this one. The Emory. Oh no. I.E. Enterprise. Eros. Can you imagine? Slave ship named Eros. Experiment. Felicity. Fidelity. Good Hope. Here's one that's gruesomely honest. The Harvest. Huntress. Intelligence. Jefferson. Lady's Delight. Lady of the Lake. Lady of the Sea. Nile Annie, spelled N-I-L-E and N-Y-L-E. North America. Planter. I guess that's straightforward. Resource. Resource. Robert Burns. Surprise. Temperance. And the last two I'll read. Trial and United States. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody, and let me also add my word of thanks to Dr. Towns and to the organizers of this wonderful conference. And I'm very delighted to be seated here with the other panelists and to have heard Professor Caetano de Souza. He reminded me of the first exchange I had with a Congolese scholar. I was there for 3 semesters doing research between 2006 and 2007. And he said to me, if you want to understand Congolese indigenous religion, go to the diaspora. And I've always been very suspicious and a little bit disappointed when I hear diaspora practitioners of African religions talk about how in Africa they've distanced themselves from their indigenous traditions and we are the ones re-educating them. It's a little arrogant and problematic for me when I hear that. But it was very interesting to hear this Congolese scholar affirm the diaspora as a place where Congolese religion, indigenous religions have been preserved. And having done 15 months of research there, I began to understand why he would view the issue in that way. the level of Afrophobia that has overtaken religious Afrophobia, Christian-inspired religious Afrophobia that has overtaken that nation is unimaginable. It's the worst that I've ever experienced in any part of the continent or the diaspora. So I am very pleased, and in listening to Professor Reddie, he reminded me of the space that I embody. I very much am a person who made the passage from the Caribbean, from Jamaica to the northeastern United States. I grew up in Hartford, Connecticut, a hub of Jamaican immigrants. And much of what he talked about reminded me of my own upbringing. But I am a woman who has claimed African American identity as well. It's the African American identity that allowed me to survive the brutal, vicious racism of Hartford, Connecticut, or I should say Wethersfield, Connecticut, at a time when my parents just didn't have the resources to analyze that. African Americans really provided that kind of conscientization, so I've always claimed both identities, actually. For me, many of the panelists have already addressed issues that I would take up, but for me, I will probably speak a little bit out of my disciplinary training as a theological scholar. And so when I got the question of how do history and memory shape us as African diaspora people, the first sub-question I began to ask myself was, whose memory? And for me, I thought of it in a kind of dichotomous way because of the way in which much of the scholarship has emerged. I asked, whose memory, the slave ships or the Israelites? Whose history, whose memory, the ring shouters or the institutional black church? Whose memory? My non-Christian great-grandmother, and I mean this literally, she was very much non-Christian in a Jamaican culture, rural culture that was increasingly very Christian, at least on the surface in terms of what we confess, or my Christian mother's memory. And so the work that I've been doing has constantly reminded me that national and ecclesial histories weigh heavily upon what we as academics remember and do not remember. And so I want to speak a little bit as a theologian because of the ways in which my research and teaching forced me to reconsider all the more what I'm doing in this academic scholarly space as a theologically trained person who likes to bring theological questions to the study of African diaspora religions. In theology, we talk a lot about a community of accountability, or maybe even communities of accountability. And it became very clear to me that my community of accountability goes far beyond the visible world domain of African diaspora peoples that may be represented across a number of religious traditions. It actually extends into the invisible world domain. So the community of ancestors is a very important community for me in terms of the work that I do. And when I think about their histories and their memories, I think about how it stretches back beyond the Middle Passage to West and Central Africa in many cases, sometimes parts of East Africa, but also through the Middle Passage into an experience of being rendered chattel and enslaved in the Americas and the Caribbean. And for me, that's a history in terms of the enslavement that begins in the early 1500s. And I take very seriously, I'm here at Yale, and Jonathan Butler has talked about the Christianization process of African Americans as a spiritual holocaust. I take very seriously the work of historians who've helped us to see that Christianity spread very slowly among peoples of African descent who were enslaved in the Americas and the Caribbean. And so what does that mean when my discipline encourages us, and I very much am a liberation theological thinker, when my discipline encourages us to access the period of slavery as a very crucial period for resources for how we think about liberation theology. What that means to me is that all of our ancestors were not Christian. And in fact, if we look at the period as a whole, most of them were not Christian. If we look at from the 1500s to where we are now, So what does it mean that I might select some ancestors and not others? What does it mean that we do select some ancestors and not others, and what's guiding that? Alice Walker's, as a womanist theologian, Alice Walker has been very important to me. And her declaration, her statement that we have been beggars at the table of a religion that sanctioned our destruction is in the backdrop of that for me. Because when I studied at Union Theological Seminary with James Cone and James Washington and Dolores Williams, and when I began, it was in conversations with my colleagues where I couldn't understand why people were so invested in saying how not African we were. I just didn't understand it in my body. I just really didn't because of my own upbringing. I agree with Dr. Reddie. I mean, our ancestors don't, our parents and aunts and uncles, they don't claim it, but we live it. We were living so many things in my own home that were just not a part of institutional Christianity. So I was trained much more as an African American as a Caribbean as I had to learn the Caribbean stuff on my own. So I would be having conversations with my colleagues, and I began to think, well, maybe it is my Caribbean heritage that's shaping this. I think a little differently now. I think we are in denial about how African U.S. North America has been also. But I began to think that, and that's what led me to do a project. I was very interested in the Curse of Ham and theological anthropology, but that's what led me to do a project on Jamaica. And in doing it, when I went to the literature, I couldn't avoid the reality that we had no institutional black church presence in the Caribbean, in the same way that we'll talk about the independent black church tradition in the United States. We had the missionary colonial church, Afrophobic and anti-African, and we had African religious movements. And I was not willing to Christianize those African religious movements in the ways that I believe some of my colleagues were. And as I looked at that literature, I saw liberation motifs emerging out of that literature. Wallene Dodson, sociologist of religion, who went to Cuba to do work on African Methodist Episcopalian women and their liberation strategies and praxis histories, had to start studying the African-derived religions because that's where the liberation struggles were. She's an expert on African-derived religions because she didn't let her Christian lens bias her in looking at the literature. She said, if I'm looking for liberation praxis and it's leading me to the African-derived religions, well, that's where I'm going to go. And so that's what I have tried to do in my work. And what's interesting about it, the womanists, and really the third world feminist theologians, the Asian feminist theologians, Latin American, Native American womanists, they're the ones that really helped me with method because it was clear that if we were going to know about women's experiences, we had to engage them. I mean, we just don't have a lot of printed material laying around about women's experience, whether it's a Christian church experience or non-Christian. And so we had to look at ethnographic methods. We had to look at other disciplinary approaches to help us access that data. And what's interesting about the Caribbean context, and this is not true everywhere, but when I look at Jamaica, for example, we're talking about traditions that have been demonized. So there's a religious cultural oppression there. There's definitely racial oppression. There's gender oppression because women are disproportionately represented in these traditions, and class oppression. And so it's been a very important place for me to think about Alice Walker's question and even James Baldwin's critical contributions to African American Christian experience. I see a lot of the work that I'm interested in lining up with the debate that emerged among Charles Long, James Cone, Cecil Cone, Gay Rada Wilmore, on the question of the relationship between black theology and black religion and the African heritage. And, James Cone, early on, he was a wonderful advisor, and I still just so appreciate that that's the person I did my work with. James Cone identified these themes of justice, hope, love, suffering, and freedom in black religion. But James Baldwin reminds us that the backdrop of African American conversion to Christianity is shame. And Dolores Williams taught me that if we don't name the oppression properly, if we misdiagnose the oppression, we really can't understand what we need to be free from. And so my work has taught me that the only thing that we need to be free from is not racism. It's Afrophobia, it's anti-Africanness, especially as it relates to African-based religions in the Americas and the Caribbean. I want to put out there for all of us to think about this history of conquest, this history of colonialism and enslavement. And I think at the center of much of what I do is still trying to examine how Christianity has been implicated in that. And not just white Christianities, but black Christianities. Black Christianities are a part of the problem. And so I think I might leave it there and let us open up for questions after. Thank you.
Oh, what a conference. What a set of conversations. What a gathering. Cicely Emily Towns, she's the only one who can bring all of us together like this. What an intellectual giant and spiritual gem she is. Let's just give her a hand, y'all. Let's just give her. I don't know where she is. She might be listening somewhere. But this is so unique. It's just so special. And we love you for it too. We love you, we respect you. I tell you, boy, the Yale University will never be the same again. And she just got here a couple of years ago, but it's really something. Good God Almighty. I also want to recognize my dear sister who's going to be president of my beloved institution, Union Seminary, Sister Serene Jones. And this is very important, very important. We want to support Sister Serene because you can't talk about black religion without talking about James Cone, James Washington, James Forbes, Dolores Williams, Professor Stewart. It goes on. What a rich tradition. And we're moving to the 21st century. We want to make sure that the caretakers of that institution acknowledge the degree to which prophetic religion in part is predicated on those institutions that wrestle with people of African descent and how we make sense of the world. Last but not least, of course, I want to acknowledge Tavis Smiley, one of the few celebrities who uses his power as a form of service and love for black folks. Mr. Tavis in the back. Brother Tavis in the back. So good to see you, though, brother. Love you so much. You know how difficult it is once you get in the stratosphere of the celebrity world. You become a peacock and just show your foliage. Yeah, peacock struck because they can't fly. Brother Tavis is an eagle. Still keeps track. Still wants to serve. The question itself, how does history and memory shape us as a diasporic people? I said to myself, well, I just need to reread Beloved. Yeah, I need to reread Beloved. You see, that's our text. You see, why? Because we really try to engage in those unspeakable things unspoken and those unutterable things unutterable is to acknowledge the degree to which, for black people especially, history begins with a catastrophe and a series of catastrophes that pile wreckage upon wreckage. And the question is, what are you going to do with the catastrophic? What does it mean to be on intimate terms with forms of death in a death-ducking, death-dodging, death-denying civilization like the USA? What does it mean to live in close proximity to terrorism for 400 years and then live in a nation that believes that the history of terrorism begins in 9/11? You got fundamental clash of Weltanschauung, of worldviews, and the role of the scholars that we've heard, and the poets, and our musicians is how do we remain true to the lived experience of those Sly Stone called everyday people as they wrestle with the catastrophic. That's why our great figure Ralph Waldo Ellison says, the blues is what? Autobiographical chronicle of a personal catastrophe expressed lyrically. And we could add with elegance, with a smile, with resilience. How you gonna keep hope on a tightrope? How do you not surrender to the white supremacy grounded in white greed that devames black bodies and exploits black labor and denies black rights? The white supremacy that tells black people every day for 400 years, and especially the 244 years, black love is a crime. Black history is a curse. Black freedom is a pipe dream. Black hope is a joke. You better accept this niggerization all the way down that leads you to hate yourself and violate yourself and be so scared and be so intimidated that you defer to the powers that be because you feel as if you are not human, you're not an agent in history, you can't make a difference. And how is it that black folk in the midst of that kind of catastrophe can still forge a love against the law? Because when you love your mama, you don't want her to be treated like she's just a breeder in some capitalist project that generates profits. When you love your child, you don't want them to be sold from Texas to North Carolina and just keep track of them to make sure that as they move forward in their trajectory, you have some influence and they move from the mama's womb to tomb. Black love is a crime because if you really love black people, and we don't have enough scholars who really love black people enough to tell them the truth about themselves in such a way that they can be empowered in their wounds and their scars and in their bruises to deal with that, because we as scholars are just as wounded and bruised and scars as Jamal on the corner and Letitia around the block. We are an extension of them, a spiritual, a moral, a political extension of them. We just happen to be those particular Negroes or ex-Negroes who like to read a lot of books. It's true. Oh, we know. I mean, scholars do tend to sometimes be socially underdeveloped. You know what I mean? The ones who couldn't get nobody to dance at the party, so you got a little extra time on your hands. Now, we ain't going to get into that, but let's just keep it real here. Yes, right. Emily giving us another chance. My sister. Emily giving us another chance to bounce back. But the point is this. The point is this. That we have to first be honest and candid about the history. If we love the people, respect them enough to tell them the truth about what they're dealing with so they can understand the heroic energy that they're mustering with those folk formulations that Brother Reddie talked about. This is what deeply upset me about my dear brother Obama's speech the other day. You see? From the vantage point of prudence and political expediency, masterful. From the vantage points of truth, profoundly disappointing. How do we deal with the tension? I love my brother. I support my brother. I told him over and over again, I'm going to break my neck to get him to the White House, and when he wins, I'm going to break dance in the morning. And the next day I'll be his major critic, because it's not fundamentally about him. It's about ordinary people being in power. But the problem is, how do we get the truth out? You see what I mean? How do we get it out? There was no accident. He couldn't tell the history of racial injustice because it cut too deep. You had to sidestep over it. And it's not true that slavery is America's original sin. That's not true. The subjugation and the dispossession and extermination of indigenous peoples. America was a corporation before it was a country. Profit, imperial expansion. Yes, slavery is vicious, ugly, inexplicably, very much like the show of our Jewish brothers and sisters in Jew-hating Europe. But we got to get the story right. You're talking about the generosity and the decency of the American people. Okay, I know you got to say that, my dear brother. But when did the decency really start kicking in? I mean, I mean, slavery, Jim Crow, American terrorism, lynching, brutal police brutality, prison industrial complex, disgraceful school system, no health care, no job care, no child care, not enough jobs with a living wage. When is that decency going to kick in all the way down, not just in vanilla suburbs? Let's be honest about it. Now, if we're going to be poets, especially, and by poets I mean what Shelley meant, poets are the unacknowledged legislatures of the world, which means those who muster their imagination and empathy in such a way that they use language and song to try to reshape people and touch their hearts and minds and souls and their bodies to get them in motion so they can do something before they die. That's why Beethoven called himself a poet of tones. That's why Coltrane's a poet. That's why Curtis Mayfield's such a great poet, not just because he writes lyrics, but the dialectical interplay between that sound and that silence, that he touches us in such a way that we want to keep on pushing. How can our scholarship ascend to that level so that it becomes so empowering and enabling and ennobling to everyday people, not by pandering to them, but telling them truths that push them up against the wall, but do it in such a way very much like Stevie Wonder's songs In the Key of Life, that shakes folk in such a way that the best of them can come forward because you believe in them enough to give them the benefit of being wrong as well as right, but they feel the love in the words that you use, in the books that you write, and the humility that you do it in because you love them. That, to me, is in part what we have to teach, not just each other. I think actually something to teach the world, the history and memory, because the memory is traumatic. How do you cope with the trauma? How do you get elegance, sophistication, refinement? How do you get Lester Young out of trauma? How do you get Billie Holiday out of trauma? How do you get Bob Marley out of trauma? We haven't yet to dig deep enough to answer that question, though Toni Morrison getting close. And Ellison and Baldwin and a few others close, but the others who enacted. What a challenge. Let me stop there because we got to have time for questions and queries. But that, for me, is the beginning of a conversation about this crucial question at this magnificent conference, headed by that magnificent woman, Emily Town.
Thank you all so much for getting the conversation started. I have been given instructions to go until 1:45, which gives us about 20 minutes to take questions from the community. So I invite you now to come to the microphone and to offer your questions.
My name is Luke Bassett. I study environmental ethics at Yale Divinity School and the School of Forestry. And I'd like to ask, what has the experience of place as a location of history and memory been in the diaspora, and perhaps how it might inform issues of environmental justice? Thanks.
Professor Steptoe has written one of the finest texts dealing with space and topi, and From Behind the Veil there, brother. Yeah, that's a classic, you know that.
Thank you very much, Cornel. I don't know if I have much to say about environmental justice, however. You seem to be eager to...
Well, a couple things came to mind for me. There's a place in western Jamaica in the parish of Westmoreland called Abeokuta. And that place was named by Yoruba indentured laborers who came to Jamaica in the post-slavery period after 1838 to work as indentured laborers because the formerly enslaved population did not want to work on the plantations, and the British government sought the solution of taking rescued Africans that were en route to slave plantations and other slave locations in Cuba and Brazil, and resettling them first in Sierra Leone, and while they figured out what they were going to do with them. So some of them ended up in Jamaica and other parts of Guyana, Antigua, Trinidad, I mean, you know, name it, throughout the Caribbean. And this community that spoke Yoruba up into the 1970s, it's been documented into the 1970s in Jamaica, has retained a tradition that we call etu in Jamaica, where food preparation is really important to the ritual in terms of preparing for that ritual of commemorating ancestors and celebration. A lot of this gets reduced to dance, secular kinds of institutions that can survive Christianization and Afrophobia. It's not threatening, but there really are sacred traditions behind these dances that become part of our festival genre in commemorating the African heritage in the Caribbean, which is still, as far as I'm concerned, on some levels, another colonialist project. But they, you know, when the enslaved Africans came to places like Jamaica, they saw Africa. I mean, they recognized in the environment, the landscapes of Africa. These were tropical places where they were able to continue to reproduce similar diets. They used, you know, similar kinds of provisions and vegetables, and they ate much of the same food, even though the culinary traditions may have been modified. So that's really important, and I think that was very significant to the preservation of these African-derived religions. Now, an important part of what I've learned in working with these communities that maintain these traditions is how holistic, how connected these religions are to nature, and how they respect the divine force in natural elements, and their approach to nature is often one that really coheres with environmental ethics. In terms of how the land should be preserved and treated, and how we find medicines in nature, in the mountains, in forests, and what we do with them, and how we use and we take from nature in a way that's always keeping at the center of what we do an ethic of replenishing, as opposed to an ethic of waste, of overuse, of exploitation. So I haven't explored it extensively, but it really does come through as a core value in these religious traditions, and I find it, I mean, I've been to all kinds of African religious ceremonies in New York City. I mean, I did my PhD in New York, I was in Brooklyn regularly.
And in the blackest state in Brazil, someone referred to anti-black, black Afrophobia. These are the first places that get sold off for project development, for betterment of the city of Bahia, for Salvador, for example. And there doesn't seem to be there don't seem to be very strong voices to insist that these places be preserved, even in the town that makes probably a third of its living off of tourism of Afro-Brazilian religion. The other part of that, of course, is in terms of place, another part of not in Brazil, but just about everywhere, is where do we dump our stuff? And we tend to dump it where the poor people are. And in this country, and a large part in Brazil, and a lot of the Caribbean, that's where the poorest black folk are.
Okay. Well, I definitely would like to thank the organizers for this conference and the panelists, because I think that this conversation is fundamental. My name is Regine, and my family is from Haiti. And I grew up in a household where there was, my parents converted to Jehovah's Witness in the 1970s. Someone came and knocked on our door. And as descendant of immigrants, we weren't supposed to open the door. I don't know if they didn't have their papers. It was always some type of thing like, don't answer the door. But for some reason, my parents answered the door, and that became their faith. But at a very young age, I told my family that I knew I would never be Jehovah's Witness. And the reality is that I would never be Christian. I'd never be Christian fundamentally because of just the history of how Christianity was brought to us. And I think, and I respect everyone here that has decided to follow in that path and to uphold Christianity. But one of the reasons why I feel comfortable, very much like Vilson here, is because fundamentally as people of African descent, we are spiritual people. And so the reason why we can be in a room today, whether we're all academics or whatever the reason is, on a fundamental level, spirit moves us. The reason why, this brother here from England, so many things that he grew up with, I grew up with that also, but my mother would never say, as a Jehovah's Witness, she could never say what it was, the proverbs, the intonation, the whatever it is that happened. But you know, for me, I think it's important that we know our history. Voodoo was fundamental in not only the liberation of Haiti, but throughout the Caribbean. And though we are afraid to speak it, though it has not been said here at this conference, we need to acknowledge our African ancestors. We need to acknowledge those that kept the faith, that did not turn away, that were killed, the French Code, that Code Noir, that was diabolical. And if you haven't read it, you should read it. You should know why we had to convert to Christianity, why many chose to. And for those of us that have chosen not to, I can understand, you know, for those of you that have. I mean, the church is fundamental here in the United States in keeping culture and tradition. The reason why I can ride the train in Brooklyn and have so many young people be disrespectful, I know the reason why. It's because they don't have church. But church is greater than Christianity. Church is fundamental in community. So we don't have that community that's keeping us together. So whether we are going to an Akom, going to a Bembe, whether we're going to Mama Lolo's house to bring down the gods, whatever it is, that is where we pass on our traditions. And that is what is significant, that we continue. So if we're doing it here in academia, if we're doing it in our house, we're doing it, you know, wherever it is that we are, that is what is significant. Keep the culture alive, keep the tradition alive, and respect those that have different views. Because on a fundamental level, we move through spirit. And spirit is what connects all of us here today. So I just want to say thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Another question?
Yes, good afternoon. My name is David Caprema-Warden. I'm a doctoral student at Harvard. I want to thank the panel and obrigado também ao professor Vilson. Luis, por favor, traduz a pergunta. I'm very, very grateful for the presence of, in this particular panel, of representatives, either students of researchers in or practitioners of non-Christian African diaspora religions. I think it's one of perhaps the last acceptable forms of exclusion that we have, or the last normativities that we take for granted, is that of a Christian normativity or of a religious exclusivism that I think often goes unquestioned. So I'm very grateful for at least this panel having the voices of people who are representing other religions other than Christianity. In the 2 years that I spent living and working in Bahia, Brazil, and especially with movements of ecumenism and interreligious dialogue, the thing that I most observed and that most bothered me is the silence or even active dismissal on the part of Protestant churches, among which I counted myself as working among and participating with, silence of or even active dismissal and even worse, demonization of the Candomblé religion or of other African-derived religions in that context. And so I think it's very important for those of us who are Christians, and especially theologians, to think very seriously about our own tradition and its culpability, its role, at least in either its silence or its active dismissal and demonization of African traditions, African religious traditions. And I think that there are various alternatives that are being developed, but very rarely talked about. And I think the whole theology of religions debates are things that we can really tap into. Although I think, just to say just a brief word about that, we tend to sometimes talk about a theology of religious pluralism and various kind of open-ended acts of or notions of tolerance. But I think we really do need to go a lot further than that, because I think it's very often easy to simply say, yes, we can accept some validity or some grace within other religious traditions, but then continue to ignore them or continue to marginalize them or pretend that they don't really make a difference on my own practice and my own thought. I think one of the most important things that we can do by listening to people like Professor Vilson Caetano is recognize that there are elements of truth, goodness, and beauty within non-Christian traditions, and so some of the particularities that I think theologians need to be engaged with, not simply acknowledging the goodness within other traditions, but engaging deeply the particularities of them to get a sense of what we can perhaps learn even about our own selves as Christians or as practitioners of that religion, how we can learn. And I think Vilson and Caetano mentioned a number of things. For example, Professor Stewart as well.
Do you have a question? Do you have a particular
yes,
question?
Sorry.
We need to make room for
Thank you very much for letting me know. I'll keep it brief then, but among the few things... Yeah, the question, it's mainly just a comment, and let me just ask for a response if there would be one. The importance of being attentive to the particularities of other traditions, and I think that one of the things that we could be attentive to is what Professor Vilson mentioned, which is the notion of syncretism, or the fluidity and complexity of religious identities, and the understanding that conversion doesn't necessarily always mean a renunciation, and what that means in the experience of African-derived people, slaves, especially in parts of Brazil and Caribbean that have been mentioned. Thank you.
Would any of our panelists like to respond to the comments that have been made?
I would just add this, though. I think that we also want to accent the degree to which there's a richer Judaic tradition in the history of black peoples in the modern world, a rich Islamic tradition, more and more rich Buddhist tradition, and so forth. When we're talking about religions, we're talking about all of the various ways in which that religare, that binding, that sense-making, imposing some kind of order on the chaotic world is at work, that makes references to God or some notion of a power beyond. I mean, you got Coltrane and Howard Thurman. Nobody know what they were. They just love folk. They ecumenical in some special space. They're not Christian, they're not Judaic, they're not Islamic, they're not Buddhist. They just Howard Thurman and John Coltrane. But the thing is, you got a lot of different kind of Negroes trying to make sense of the world. And this is one of the few conferences that acknowledge that, even though it's true that we don't have our black Jewish, black Islamic, black Buddhist, black spiritualist folk all represented. You can't do that kind of conference and pull off the high quality that you have, because it's not just a matter of numbers. It's a matter of trying to get some kind of spirit in the dialogue. But I do want to accent this crucial role of plurality and heterogeneity in black religious practices. What do you want to say?
We have about 5 minutes left, and so I'm going to go to this side of the room, and then we'll come here, and then we'll let the panelists respond. So why don't we ask the 2 questions, and then we'll invite our panelists.
This is a very short question, but one that I wrestle with continuously, and it has to do with memory and violence. And I'd like for you to help me think further about the ways in which catastrophic violence, in its grand forms or its small forms, affects the imaginations of individuals and peoples in such a way that it, to use a medical image that's often used, it carves a track through the brain, that it's the pattern of violence that gets traced over and over and over again in the patterns of imagination that follow from it, rather than a disruption of the violence. And sometimes those patterns of trauma and violence can be as pleasurable as what we could possibly imagine. And it seems in the sorting through the role of history and memory, how do we begin to discern those places in which we're reenacting the trauma and the violence rather than disrupting it and issuing in something new? I think in ways that might also connect with this morning's panel.
We've talked about history and memory from the past. Thank you. I'm Mary Hinton. I'm an assistant professor at Misericordia University in the Religious Studies Department. My primary area of research has been megachurches, and that's the frame within which I'd like to ask this question. We've talked about history and memory from the past. How do you respond to the fact that in some areas the historic black church is being overtaken by megachurches which rely on dismantling our history and which systematically and ritualistically requires that I forget where I come from and focus exclusively on my financial and personal well-being in the future? How do we address that need for a historicity, if that's a word, within these mega churches? That's my question.
All right. Reddie, you're the last one if you have a question. And I'm going to just allow the panelists to respond as they feel in need.
My name is Reginald Backus. I'm a second-year student here at Yale Divinity School. My question is about passing on the history and the memory. A lot of us, the history and the memory has been passed on through the oral tradition, through parents and things such as that. And what I'm asking now is, in my generation, as I see, not a lot of us are reading books. So for the things that you said, I believe they're so enlightening, but how do we transfer that information in new and creative ways? YouTube, MySpace, Facebook. I want to hear you all speak to that, how we reach the next generation and passing on this history and memory so it's relevant and we can use that to create new avenues for the future. So, thank you.
We have a couple minutes. I invite you to respond to any of those questions in any way that you feel led.
Agradecer pelas perguntas.
He would like to thank for the questions.
E eu gostaria, na verdade, de retomar algumas questões.
And he would like to go back and revisit some of the questions.
Dizer, em primeiro lugar, de que eu nunca tive dúvidas que a minha demonização como homem negro ou como mulher negra...
Você nunca teve o quê?
Dúvidas.
De quê?
De que a minha demonização como homem negro e mulher negra...
He wants to say that he never doubted that the fact that he was demonized as a man or a woman, a black man or a black woman.
Ela não passa simplesmente pela questão religiosa.
It's not restricted to the religious realm.
Mas ela faz parte de um projeto político mais amplo que desde cedo associou as minhas características físicas com aquilo que eu sou capaz de fazer.
But it is a part of a larger political project that has, from the very beginning, associated his physical features to an image of what he would be capable of doing.
Foi esse mesmo racismo que no Brasil provoca que no Brasil nos torna invisíveis.
And this is the sort of racism that makes black people in Brazil invisible.
Ou dissolve essa nossa memória, ou essa nossa história, ou essa nossa identidade através da ideia de miscigenação.
And it relies on the idea of miscegenation to destroy this memory and this history.
Ou a ideia de um grande paraíso racial representado por uma harmonia entre os diferentes grupos.
And the idea of a paradise, a racial paradise, where all the races would be in harmony.
Exemplo.
An example.
Se eu fosse budista, ou se eu fosse muçulmano, ou qualquer outra construção religiosa que os descendentes de africanos podem assumir.
If, as an African Brazilian, I would be a follower of any tradition such as Buddhism or Islam,
ou mesmo protestante,
or even Protestant,
eu transitaria ou estaria em outros locais que eu não posso estar pelo fato de estar ligado a uma religião africana reorganizada no Brasil.
I would be able to transit in some spaces that where I'm not allowed to be because I follow a tradition of African, a religion, an African religion that was reorganized in Brazil.
Então, de fato, temos que reconhecer que, embora precisamos estar abertos para outras religiões,
and I want to recognize that despite the fact that we have to be open to other religious experiences,
ainda há uma resistência muito grande com relação às religiões que foram reorganizadas na diáspora a partir das tradições africanas.
We still face the resistance to any sort of religious experience that has been rooted in African tradition.
E mais uma vez eu agradeço a vocês o fato de estar aqui conversando, porque eu não sou budista, eu não sou muçulmano, eu não sou protestante, mas eu sou de candomblé.
And I thank you for the opportunity to be a part of this conversation, even though I'm not a Buddhist, I'm not a Protestant, I'm not, a member of any other of those religious traditions, but I am a member of a candomblé.
Por fim, retomar a ideia de que nós temos que rever um pouco o nosso entendimento sobre a transmissão dessa memória.
And we really need to revisit the idea of how we should pass on this tradition.
A memória, ela não precisa estar escrita em nenhum livro.
Memory does not need to be written down in the form of a book.
Somos nós que temos que ser atentos e atentas ao nosso corpo, à dinâmica da nossa vida e à vida de nossas comunidades.
We have to be attentive to the dynamics of our bodies, our communities.
Foi graças a essa dinâmica de estar presente no mundo encarnado nas pessoas que nós estamos aqui.
It is because of this nature of the incarnate experience in the world that we are here.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Professor Towns has indicated that if any other panelists have a very brief final word, then you're invited to do that. If not, we will bring this time to a close. Anyone feel the need to?
It's not on. Oh, it is. Okay. Just to respond to Professor Jones's question about trauma. I mean, I don't think I took very good notes. I'm not sure I remembered all of it, but I'm just wondering if the way we've done theology, when I think about the Bible and how trauma is so central to the Bible and suffering and the way we've theologized, we are reinscribing in many ways these histories, and we're socialized to embrace them and to celebrate them in a sense. I'm wondering if I like the way someone like Robert Warrior looks at the Exodus, or Dolores Williams. There is a certain kind of truth-telling about the horror of the trauma. And so there's a way in which it gets sanitized in other theological conversations that I think we need to do a much more honest job of truth-telling about what's really there in the narratives. And we need to interrogate the harmonizing theological categories that we just love to place over the narratives of the Bible in our lives, which are really out of step in many cases with what's there in the text. And I use text now as Chung Hyun Kyung, my body, who I am, where I'm located, and Bible as context at this point. So what's there in the text and the context. So, I mean, there's more that I would and could say, but it's just an initial response. And the question about the megachurches and the transfer of history and memory, I don't know. I mean, I think about this so much in terms of my teaching. It comes up with my students. I teach more Christian theology than anything else because we just so need it. We need to know how to decipher the Creflo Dollars and the T.D. Jakeses. We need to know how to interpret them. And I think we need to be more attentive, and I'm hoping that some of the young people that are very, very accustomed to the internet will help us think of ways to bridge the gap without becoming commercialized ourselves. That's the danger, and I think that's part of the resistance from some of us in the older generation to not rush there. But we need to be imaginative about that. And in terms of the mega churches, I think we need to continue to tell that story, to tell the history, and to claim reclaim the legacy of Black liberation theology against the narratives that they're creating, and to find ways of teaching it and telling it and connecting to churches and other religious spaces, and promoting that legacy in very, very direct ways. So thank you.
Yeah, just very briefly, I mean, for me, the major foe of history and memory for today is the dominant form of free market fundamentalism. So that the mega churches and what's happening in the recording industry vis-a-vis black music and other rich forms of spiritual expression, as well as the academy itself, with market models moving in stronger and democratic models being pushed aside, that you can't have history. You got to have three dimensions of time, right? You got to have past, present, and future. And the market's all about perennial repetition of the present for bodily stimulation and instant gratification. Whereas we come from people that stirs the soul. You stir the soul by remembering the past, knowing what they went through, wondering how they got through, but you know somehow you connected them, so you might be able to get through and then pass that on to your precious baby. Without that continuity between past, present, and future, and this just affects everybody, but especially black people, because we see this among our youth, and I appreciate the brother asking the question. The technology can be used for history and memory, but the dominant form is to erase it. And instead of wrestling with the trauma and the catastrophe head on, the way Sister Serene, because I think trauma and catastrophe is always already there. It's always your constant companion. But the market response is to self-medicate and somehow think that, no, you don't want to go through the water and over the mountain. You want a pill so you can leapfrog over. That's a lot of Christian preaching that goes on in these mega churches. So the mega churches, not a lot of mega love, not a lot of mega history, not a lot of mega justice, just the big mega churches. See what I mean? Oh, yeah, that's something else. That's something else. You see? But all we have to say, look, we come out of a people where we're going to be true both to the best of the history, because we got gangsters, we got our hatred and bigotry like any other peoples. We're talking about the best, but we also know that our precious children are losing connection with that best. And therefore, all of this becomes sounding brass and tinkling cymbal if we can't make that connection out of love to the younger generation. That's why the fight for the souls and minds of the hip-hop generation is fundamental for anybody who has the audacity to say they a Christian or a Buddhist or a freedom fighter or a Judaic follower of justice or anything that has to do with decency and compassion. I'm sorry to go on so long, but we had a wonderful panel again.
We sure did. Yes, we did. Thank you. Thank you all very much for your patience. And thanks again, Dr. Towns, for this opportunity.